Welcome to the Fantasy NASCAR podcast. It's a super speedway week, Talladega, spring. Let's talk Xfinity Series, and I'll get you a Cup Series podcast soon enough. But today, Xfinity Series, going through all the data, and there's a ton of data in the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet, which you can get at racefortheprize.com. Go ahead and buy May for $25, and if you haven't already purchased Talladega, I'll throw it in. May, you got Texas, Kansas, North Wilkesboro, and the old Coca-Cola 600 rolling your way. Jump in on that. So as you know, when we look at Fantasy NASCAR and Super Speedways, we stack in the back. Then I've got a bunch of other silly phrases that I've come up with, but mainly just the stack in the back. And you can see the trends. What was the other one? 2010 to win. So 2010 to win, what was that? Well, on average, this was more of a Cup Series thing where you needed at least a 10th place finish from the drivers that you were selecting and around 20 place differential points. That's not always the case in Xfinity, but it's definitely a good rule of thumb when selecting drivers in the Cup Series that you really are aiming for 20 place differential points and you at least need that top 10 finish. And then the third and final phrase, say it with me, maybe don't try to build the optimal lineup, just build the winning lineup. Those are my beliefs. Stacking it back, 2010 to win, maybe more for the Cup, and then build the winning lineup, not the optimal lineup. And that opens more doors, allows more flexibility, and a lot more chasing the place differential. Whereas if you're trying to build that optimal lineup, you often get yourself in a situation where you're trying to identify the lap leader and taking two drivers starting towards the front who absolutely could ultimately crush your lineup. Take a lineup that's going to at least win you some money, but then those two drivers get into wrecks, throw a massive negative place differential point on you, and take you out of the cash zone. But, that's just a little bit of my advice. Stacking the back, 2010 to win, and build the winning lineup, maybe not the optimal lineup. So let's talk more Xfinity Series. You can see previous optimal lineups on your screen. And as you can see with the red boxes, most of these drivers are starting towards the back half of the field. And that's nothing new. We talk about that all the time. But one of the things I want to do with this podcast is, all right, we know we're stacking in the back, but which specific drivers should we be looking to stack? What types of cars? And so I've broken them into groups of Tier A, Tier B, Tier C, and then even Tier D. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But also, before we get there, where exactly are we stacking in the back? So we can go over that first. We can see here, Daytona, our average starting position was 23rd, 21st. You can see all the different numbers on the screen. If we were to average these out at the super speedways, the typical starting position of a driver in the optimal lineup was 23rd. So that is a good base point or point of reference when you're building your lineup. That's where your initial line is going to be drawn. Now, as we see qualifying play out, or as you just start to build, you can move that line forward, you can move that line back, and you don't have to say, well, I'm only playing guys starting 23rd or back, but it is a good general point of reference. If you have a lineup with a lot of guys starting inside the top 23, that's probably not likely a winning lineup. If you've got a lot of drivers starting way further back than 23rd, then maybe that's not the best idea. Now, it depends on how qualifying plays out. If you have a lot of really good drivers that you can afford starting really far back, then maybe that's the situation that you want to play. But if you're chasing a bunch of Tier D and Tier C drivers starting in the 30s, it can work. I mean, as we see here in the Dega 2024 spring race, you got Brennan Poole 27, Massey 38, Matt DiBenedetto. So not really the craziest idea. But as we can also see, sometimes chasing those C, D, D drivers doesn't always work when you have two A-tier drivers coming through. Now, you did get a 27th place starting here, Sammy Smith. So that leads us to our next point. Well, actually, the first one we want to say is, if we were going to talk about the build the winning lineup, not the optimal lineup. If we go over these 78 drivers in the pool, if we go over all the optimal lineups, 78 spots that we have filled up, of those 78, only 8, just about 10% here, have started inside the top 10. So there have been times, you want to chase one of those guys starting up front. But I believe several of those cases have been Atlanta, right? Austin Hill, which can be a little bit more, less volatile, a little more of a lap turner. You got Austin Hill starting in the top 10. That's one of those. Jesse Love starting up here. That's one of those. At least several of them have been Austin Hill situations. AJ Allmendinger, Chandler. So again, very good colleague cars at the super speedways coming through. But really, it's very rare. Right? If only 10% of the time you got 6 spots in your lineup, I don't see any need to chase that type of play. Now, when we're talking about top 20, we do tend to see drivers in that teen range slide through. So this is not necessarily 2010 to win, but you are getting like Ryan Sieg last fall at Talladega, 13 place differential points, and instead of 10, he finishes 2. So you do the math, add 8 more place differential points, 10 to 2. That's, you make up for finishing position points rather than place differential. So once you start to get to mid-teens, they are very viable based on that type of driver. So you do have to open the door. Like I said, if the line is at 23, you can creep forward into 19, 18, 17. You can creep forward up into the mid-teens. It's not necessarily going to kill you if you really like that driver and you really want to be different. So there are a lot more plays on the board, I believe, in the Xfinity Series towards the front than there are in the Cup Series, whereas the Cup Series is so even and it's so volatile that we know that 6 guys in the back are ultimately going to get all the way to the front. We can't really guarantee that with the difference in equipment in the Xfinity Series. As we'll talk about here in a second with Tier A, B, C, and D, when you break down the Cup Series, it's really hard to break. There's really a Tier A and a Tier B, but the Tier B really isn't that far off. And I might go over in the Cup Series video just the lap times from Daytona, and they're just all exactly the same. One of the more disturbing trends, though, is that not only are they the same, but they all slow down at the same time. They'll speed up at the same time. And it is kind of depressing to look at the Daytona speeds through the middle of the stages, and they're just out there turning laps and going super slow and saving fuel. And you can see that in the lap times. You can see those in the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet if you want to check that ahead, which you can get at raceforprize.com 25 for May. Happy Meals, Minecraft meals. Help me buy some. And I'm not buying them for myself. I'm not buying the $20 Minecraft meal for me. I won't eat the Happy Meal. I'll just let my son. Sometimes I'll get a Diet Coke. I splurge a little bit. So we're going back to the Tier A, B, C, and D. Again, in the Cup Series, there's really not much of a tier thing. So we see the drivers, although they're Tier B, starting 33rd, they're going to score. It's different in the Xfinity Series. Chasing a Tier D driver starting 35th hasn't been that productive. 7 times of the 78, so less than 10%, do we get a Tier D driver coming through. It's a little bit better for Tier C, but again, these backpackers who typically are fighting for a 20th place finish on a regular racetrack, the crew, the likes, we'll talk about them in a second. Your Tier B are typically the guys battling to get to the edge of the top 10, and we all have a good idea who the Tier A are. So if I'm stacking in the back, I want those drivers who are typically in the top 20 on any given week. They are the ones that over, 75% of the time are the ones where the stack in the back comes through. 24 times a Tier A driver has ended up in an optimal lineup. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily starting in the back, but for most of the time, you get a junior motorsports car starting 25th, they end up being optimal. A JGR car starting 20th, they end up being optimal. Haas car, you know the likes. Tier B, we're talking about those in between, like a big machine, a Ryan Sieg. I'm even going to pump up Jordan Anderson. Whereas Jordan Anderson, they're good. Those cars are getting better every week. But I would still not quite consider them top 20 battlers. I would probably make them a little more on that C range with the Alpha Prime on a regular week. But being that Jordan Anderson, going back to his Truck Series days, has for whatever reason had an incredible knack for building super speedway vehicles and delivering on super speedway tracks, that I'm going to consider Jordan Anderson equipment at least a Tier B equipment at a super speedway. And then, all right, so let's just break them down. So if we look at Daytona last year to kick off the season, we got Anderson, Tier B, starting 29th. I like it. If I'm stacking the back, I want to prefer Tier A, Tier B. Creed, starting 14th. Kind of got to grit your teeth a little bit right there. That one's a bit of a stretch. We ran up front the entire day. It is quality equipment. But to be quite honest, we've experienced the Sheldon Creed place differential chase several times this season. And if you're going to do it at a regular track, then why not do it at a super speedway? Chandler Smith last year, colored car, starting 19th, Tier A. It's not starting 23rd, but again, if 23rd is the line, he's in 19th, great equipment. You don't have too much of a problem with that. Austin Hill starting up front. If there is one driver that we will trust starting at the very front at a super speedway, it's Austin Hill or possibly a Jesse Love in those really fast RCR super speedway cars. You don't like doing it. I know it kind of violates the trend of build the winning lineup, not the optimal lineup. And if you did go to the Austin Hill, start him in the front situation at Daytona, yeah, it looked good for a little while. And Austin Hill is doing his thing, and then he wrecks. And then it kind of proves the point of, yep, probably should have built that winning lineup, not the awesome lineup. Yeah, well, you say that this time, but last time it worked. Yeah. So then we look at Ryan Ellis, Alpha Prime, C tier type of equipment. Usually on a given week, they're battling between 20th and 30th. You don't love it, but we do know that a C car is more likely to come through before a D car, and you get him at 36th. Not a terrible play. And he does fit that 20-10 to win, more so than anybody else. He gets you 25 place differential points, 11th place finish. BJ pulls through, and I'm calling it Tier D equipment. Maybe you want to call it Tier C. Would not have loved that play, but he is starting the very back. We do occasionally see one pull through. It's just not a high probability play. But again, at Daytona, which I argue is usually a little bit more volatile than Talladega, that I think you're more likely to see the Ds come through. As you can see down here, again, the next year at Daytona in the spring, we got 2 Ds that came through. And you can make an argument that, hey, Vaccarella's in Alpha Prime equipment. And you said that was Tier C. And that is true. His car probably was Tier C. The man who runs the Alpha Prime conglomerate, I don't know, and make the energy bites. I've considered getting their protein, but I'm like, it doesn't really fit the macros correctly. And I think I'll just stick with Quest and deal with the gastrointestinal issues that come along with them. Or maybe Atlas. Maybe even consider that David bar. I think it's just too expensive, though. Looks interesting. It's got great investors behind it, but that David bar is a little too pricey for me. I can't afford Happy Meals. How am I supposed to buy that? Anyway, say that Baccarella, Alpha Prime, selling you the protein. I downgraded Tier D just because he's not really the greatest race car driver ever. You can argue it's Tier C equipment, but I would say Tier D driver. Anyway, he pulls off basically what McLeod pulls off. Runs around the 25th to 30th the entire time, and then pops at the end. Same thing with Patrick Emmerling. Don't really love the equipment. Probably a little bit more experience than Baccarella. But again, you're on that 20-10 to win range and a little bit more volatile race. Don't necessarily think we get that at Talladega. I think you get more lap turning at Talladega stages 1 and 2, and then you'll get a little bit of shake up in stage 3. But for these guys to play out, you really need a couple, if not several cautions at the very end. If you get one caution and one reset, you don't see a Baccarella or Immerling making a big run or push at the end. They don't get forward at the end by navigating the draft or having a great restart. They move forward at the end because, all right, 5 cars just got taken out. 5 more got taken out. Oh, there's 3 more taken out. And then you start calculating how many cars have been taken out, and they've all of a sudden moved up to the top 10 because everybody else is on a wrecker. I think that's more of a Daytona thing than Talladega. We go back to the spring race here. I'm not really doing these in order, and it doesn't matter what order. We have Jordan Anderson car, B tier, starting 38th. Yes, please. Harrison Burton this year with the newly improved AM Racing. 32, tier B. Yes, please. You got to take a chance, Jesse Love. Who doesn't love Love? Well, if you played Austin Hill, you didn't love Love. You went with Austin Hill, and it looked good until he didn't. And then you're like, I should have went with Love. I shouldn't have chose hate. You chose violence. Jeremy Clements, tier C. Yep, starting 25th. Doable. Not off the world. You'd like him starting 25th, maybe compared to others. Just depends, it was his day. He survived the race. Daytona Summer. You got a 26. You got a B. And I got a Ryan C. They say, yes, please. Jordan Anderson. Again, I don't know if you noticed my tweet. I believe it was. I have to check my own tweets. I don't remember them. I'll memorize them. In the last 8 Super Speedway races, there's been a Jordan Anderson car in the Opta lineup in 6 of those races. Last 8 Super Speedway races, 6 Jordan Anderson races. Sam Mayer starting 38th. Yup. Ryan Truex sticking it to you, starting inside the top 10. Occasionally, right? About 10% of the time, we get a top 10 driver who ends up optimal. But when you know the field and you think, all right, if we just play the game theory out, how many people are going to build this lineup? How many people are going to build it with Ryan Truex? Who else are they going to chase in the top 10? I probably didn't need to chase Ryan Truex. I probably could score maybe a point or 2 fewer with a place differential play. And that's something you can check out in the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet, which actually, here, we'll just look at it right now. So you didn't want to risk it with Truex. He scored you 57 points, and instead you stacked in the back. You took Kyle Sieg, and yeah, you forfeited 10 points, but you did end up with 7 or 6 of the top 7. Or, well, what? You got scores 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. So you lost 10 points, but you took the place differential. You built a pretty good lineup. And you're just banking on, did anyone really build the best lineup with Ryan Truex? So I think you would have been just fine. Would like to look at the results from that and see. If I had to guess, I guarantee the winning lineup was these guys and these guys. That's just me. I could be wrong. Maybe there is some mad genius out there that absolutely nailed that lineup. Kligerman starting 12th, tier B, a little trickier. I don't know if I would have wanted to go there. Let's go back to that lineup again and see if there was an alternative to Kligerman, starting a little further back. Yeah, you wouldn't want Chandler, even though Chandler did do well starting up front. Riley Harps putting the points up. So Blaine Perkins, 45 fantasy points. Got your top 10. Not bad. I wouldn't necessarily want to chase that. I think I will leave it Honeyman for Young, who he's been in 3 optimal lineups. I think the last 5. Sugar Daddy. Sugar Man. Maybe you watched Sugar Man. About what's that? Carlo Rodriguez. Very cool documentary. Highly recommend it. Guy out of Detroit, kind of folk singer. I think I've talked about this before. Just disappears off the face of the earth. His one album never goes anywhere. Then all of a sudden, some record store in South Africa starts selling Rodriguez albums. And meanwhile, Rodriguez is living in poverty, a musician that never made it. During the 60s, recorded like some kind of folksy rock and roll. And then they find out about, hey, Rodriguez is still alive. Meanwhile, he's living in poverty in America. And he's like, yeah. And they fly him in to South Africa, and the dude's like the biggest rock star ever 30 years after he is done and quit playing music. So there's a documentary about that happening, like how South Africa got just in love with Sugar Man. And it kind of makes sense, though, because you think about like the poverty and destitute ways and struggles of people living in South Africa. Kind of resonated with what Rodriguez was singing about in the 60s in Detroit. Anyway, we don't care. Just give us some picks. Well, the Sugar Man is your pick. Here we go. Atlanta. Love starting up front, but then you got C and Parker Retzlaff. That's a C. Parker. Actually, I probably should bump that up to B because that's technically a Jordan Anderson vehicle. Come on, man. Step your game up. Jamie Clements starting 23rd, Chandler 12th, Van Gisbergen 13th, colored cars. Maybe when you see a colored car, maybe not this year with the specific driver we're talking about, but in the past, you could say, all right, so I moved up from 23rd, I'm getting really close to top 10, but these are colored cars that I like. And I think you had any problem with that in the past when you would do an AJ Allmendinger, Chandler Smith, same trend right there. So you had SVG, Chandler Smith. We didn't mind Justin Haley starting 10th in previous years. You had a Ross Chastain. But the colored crew of today, I don't think I would give them the same benefit of the doubt. Josh Williams starting 11th. No, thank you. Daniel Dye, as well as he's raced this year, don't necessarily think he is as crafty as these previous super speedway drivers are calling. We give the colored cars a lot of credit, but I think it's time where we also give the specific drivers, whether it be the Dinger, Haley, or Ross Chastain, a little bit more respect for what they're able to achieve in colored cars at the super speedways. It's just me. I could be wrong. But when we see Chandler Smith and Shane Van Gisbergen, also pretty good drivers, pull off some numbers like that, I don't mind. Jeffrey Earnhardt, Sam Hunt, that's a Tier B equipment, pulling through. Starting 22nd, yeah, you give me a Tier B at 22, I like it. I definitely upgrade that over a Tier C at 22, and definitely over a Tier D. And that's what the numbers suggest. That when we are given the option of, right, who am I going to play in the 20s? I want A, I want B. They come forward, they produce at a higher rate. And I think that's what you really need to do when you are making your picks rather than just taking random numbers from the 20s and 30s. Really hammer that 20th position and really try to get Bs, As if you can, possibly some C's, and I really would try to avoid going with a lot of D's. I might take more D's at a Daytona, but at a Talladega, I want A's and B's obviously in the 20s and 30s. I'll open the door to some C's. I might creep forward into the teens. That's kind of the way that I want to approach it. I think that is the last and best advice for you. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully you have an enjoyable Talladega weekend, the Xfinity Series. RaceForThePrize.com, $25 for May. If you have not purchased the April, if you go ahead and grab May, I will throw in the Talladega weekend, Alabama. So hope you have some fun. Stack in the back, 2010 to win. That's more of a Cup Series thing. and go build the winning lineup. Don't worry so much about building the optimal lineup. Trip lights, fantastic.